A black woman walked into court with tangled hair, torn clothes, and eyes fixed to the floor. Officers laughed. Her lawyer didn't care. The judge barely looked up. What no one knew was that they were mocking an undercover FBI agent investigating them all, and just days later the same people who thought they ruled the courtroom would be the ones answering to it. This isn't a story about revenge. It's the takedown of an entire system, led by a black woman who chose to disappear, so the truth could finally be seen. The fluorescent lights above the Brooklyn Heights courthouse buzzed like insects trapped in a jar, washing the room in a pale, unforgiving glow. Arielle Warren moved through the doors, slowly wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing, a heavy battered coat 2 sizes too big, worn sneakers flapping at the soles, and a knit cap pulled low over her tangled hair. But no layer could hide the truth written across her skin. Arielle was a black woman, and here in this courtroom, that fact wasn't just seen. It was judged before she ever spoke a word. At the back wall, officers Greg Foster and Brian Cooper lounged with the easy arrogance of men who had never once feared being on the wrong side of authority. Foster tilted his head toward Cooper and muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Look at her. Bet she hasn't seen soap in a month." Cooper laughed, voice echoing under the high ceilings. "Nah, man. She's probably here looking for a free meal, not a trial." They weren't whispering. They wanted her to hear. They wanted to grind her dignity into dust under their boots. Arielle lowered her head, her posture shrinking into the worn fabric of her coat, but her mind sharpened with every cruel word. She had expected this, counted on it. The tiny microphone sewn into the hem of her shirt caught every syllable, every ugly laugh. At the defense table, Michael Hensley, her court-appointed attorney, didn't even glance up from his phone. His thumb flicked lazily across the screen, eyes glassy with disinterest. To him, she was just another case number, another burden. And behind the high bench, Judge Susan Whitmore barely concealed her impatience as she sifted through the morning's docket. One glance at Arielle, black, disheveled, silent, and the judge's eyes slid away without recognition, without curiosity, without care. Everything was unfolding exactly the way Arielle had planned. She sank into the hard plastic chair at the defense table. The seat creaked under her, and the stares in the room dug deeper into her skin. She looked beaten, forgotten, disposable. Exactly the image they were most comfortable dismissing. From under her lowered lashes, Arielle caught a flicker of movement. Foster lifting his phone casually, pretending to scroll but angling the lens directly at her. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't just mocking her in the moment, he was preserving it. A souvenir for later laughs. Good, Arielle thought coldly. Let them document it. Let them damn themselves with their own cruelty. The bailiff rapped his gavel, calling the room to order. Judge Whitmore didn't bother looking at Arielle as she spoke. Defendant Warren charged with trespassing, loitering, resisting arrest. First offense. Let's move this along, Michael. Hensley leaned over, whispering without even making eye contact. Just say yes when asked if you understand. We'll have you out of here with some community service. Easy. Arielle said nothing. Behind her, the low chuckle of Foster and Cooper rumbled again, a sound like wolves growling over a kill. Bet she doesn't even know where she is, Foster snickered. Every insult, every smirk, every flash of contempt. Arielle captured it all, stored it like ammunition. She sat motionless as the clerk read the charges, silent, invisible, or so they thought. Because beneath the grime and the ragged clothing beneath the skin, they dismissed without thought. Arielle Warren was a storm gathering strength, and the storm was about to break exactly when they least expected. The courtroom faded into memory, like a scene from a bad dream. But for Arielle Warren, the next phase of the operation was even more difficult, not because of what she had to endure, but because of who she had to stop being. She vanished. No trace of the sharp-suited federal agent remained. The Arielle who once briefed intelligence teams and dissected corruption cases in government buildings now walked with a limp, spoke only in nods, and carried everything she owned in a torn plastic bag. The coat she wore hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Her hair was matted under a knit cap that smelled of smoke. Her skin, black and weathered by the elements, no longer carried the gloss of professionalism, but the grime of a system that had discarded her before it could recognize her. It wasn't just a disguise anymore. It was her reality. Arielle had gone underground before drug rings, corrupt city officials even infiltrating a white nationalist cell in Georgia. But this assignment felt more dangerous, more personal. Because this time, the people she was investigating weren't hiding behind coded language or shadowy conspiracies. They wore uniforms, carried badges, casually joked in the open, because they didn't expect anyone to care. The streets of Brooklyn Heights were unforgiving, especially at night. In the alleys behind grocery stores and subway terminals outside churches where the soup kitchens ran dry by 5:30, she became part of a crowd that society pretended not to see. And in that crowd, she met Marcia Lewis. Marcia was in her 60s with a raspy voice, sharp wit, and the gait of someone who had once danced in better shoes. She wore layers like armor and carried a plastic coffee lid. She used to collect change, or maybe just dignity. No one had ever asked. "You new out here," Marcia said one night, her eyes narrowing as they sat side by side on the cold stone steps of a closed community center. Ariel gave a slight shrug and lowered her eyes. "Mm-hmm," Marcia grunted. "You walk different, not like you belong. But I won't press. Folks learn quick out here or they don't last long." That was the start. Marcia took her under wing without knowing she was protecting someone who had once carried federal clearance. She showed Ariel where to sleep when the shelters were full, how to keep her shoes dry using plastic bread bags, how to avoid the streets when patrols got twitchy. She also taught her how to make herself smaller. Invisible. Safe. But invisibility came with a cost. One morning, as the frost still clung to the sidewalks and the city blinked into motion, Ariel sat under a bus stop shelter on Flatbush Avenue sipping weak coffee from a donation line. Across the street, she saw a frail, elderly black man waiting at a corner, his cane tapping nervously against the pavement. His coat was thin, his posture tense. A squad car pulled up. 2 officers, white young, overconfident, stepped out. One leaned against the door with a forced grin. The other advanced slowly toward the man. "What are you doing here, sir?" the officer asked. The man blinked. "Waiting for the 41 bus," he said, voice low. "Got ID," the officer pressed. "I don't think I need ID to wait on public transportation," the man replied, his eyes searching. "Wrong answer." The second officer stepped in, grabbing the man's arm. "You giving us attitude?" The man stumbled. I didn't." His cane dropped. Ariel froze her coffee, sloshing over her gloves. Her instinct, honed from years of training, told her to intervene, to shout, to flash a badge. But that wasn't her role. Not now. Instead, she pulled the threadbare blanket around her tighter, sinking into the bench eyes, watching from behind the veil of society's blind spot. The officers eventually let the man go, after humiliating him, frisking him in front of mothers and children as though dignity was something he didn't deserve. No report would be filed. No body cam would show aggression. Just another morning in America, where waiting for a bus could make a black man suspicious. Later that night, Ariel found Marcia by the back door of the shelter. She wanted to say something, anything. But Marcia just lit a cigarette with trembling hands and said, "You saw it, didn't you?" Ariel nodded. Marcia exhaled. "Ain't nothing new, baby. We all ghosts to them until we haunt 'em." Ariel didn't sleep that night, not from cold, from clarity. This wasn't just about collecting evidence. It was about enduring what people like her had endured for generations and refusing to let it remain invisible. The sun was barely up when the storm came. Ariel stood outside a corner convenience store, hunched beneath the awning, sipping the last of her coffee. She had been up since before dawn, her stomach hollow, her fingers numb from the wind. Marcia had wandered off to find an early meal line a few blocks away. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. She didn't hear the cruiser until it screeched to a halt at the curb. Officers Greg Foster and Brian Cooper stepped out with a slow, almost theatrical confidence, hands resting on their belts like cowboys in an old western well, Foster drawled, eyes settling on her. "Look who's back in our neighborhood." Ariel kept her eyes down as planned. No sudden moves, no words. "Didn't we already warn you?" Cooper said, circling around behind her. "Didn't we say loitering wasn't a lifestyle option?" Before she could respond, not that she intended to, Foster grabbed her by the arm and yanked her away from the wall, coffee cup falling and rolling toward the gutter. The force made her stumble, and the sudden pain in her shoulder nearly made her cry out. But she couldn't. Ariel's coat twisted in Foster's grip as he slammed her against the squad car, one hand pressing down on her neck while the other twisted a zip tie around her wrists. She resisted. He muttered flatly, loud enough for the body cam to pick up, "Spat at me." Ariel hadn't even spoken. Cooper radioed in the arrest while Foster leaned down close, his breath hot and foul. You better get used to being forgotten, he whispered. Nobody's coming for you. You're not anybody. Inside. Ariel's pulse hammered, not from fear, but rage and resolve. They still didn't know. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser and slammed the door. She caught her reflection in the window. Dirt-smeared face, tangled hair, brown skin against gray steel. And for the first time since the operation began, she truly looked like what the system wanted to believe. She was discarded, erased. The ride to the precinct was brief but brutal. No one spoke. No one needed to. It was already written. When they arrived, she was booked without process, no phone call, no Miranda rights, no explanation. Her fingerprints were taken. Her belongings were dumped in a plastic bin. And then she was led down a hallway thick with the stench of bleach and despair into a holding cell that reeked of old urine and sweat. The cell was meant for 10. There were at least 24. She was pushed in, and the door clanged shut behind her like a gunshot. No one made room. No one looked up. She slid to the floor, knees drawn to her chest, her back to the wall. The minutes bled into hours. Her stomach ached. No food, no water, no blanket, no answers. Ariel scanned the faces in the cell. Hollow eyes, cracked lips, skin of all shades, but mostly black and brown. A quiet chorus of the forgotten. Then the door clanged open again. They dragged Marcia Lewis in, her lip bleeding and her coat missing. "What the hell?" Ariel muttered, breaking her silence. Marcia groaned as she was dropped unceremoniously beside her. "Said I fit a description," she mumbled. "Didn't say of what." Ariel's fists clenched inside the zip ties. This wasn't just about her anymore. They were sweeping the streets clean of dignity, one lie at a time. Hours later, a different officer, one Ariel hadn't seen before, walked past the bars munching on a granola bar. He paused, looked her over and smirked. "Don't worry," he said and threw a mouthful of crumbs. "It's not so bad. You'll get used to it. Being invisible." Then he laughed and walked away. Ariel closed her eyes, letting the noise around her fade into silence. They thought she was broken, but she was recording everything, and the truth was building piece by piece, and very soon that truth would have nowhere left to hide. The cell door clanged open just after sunrise. Ariel stirred on the cold cement floor, her back aching from hours of half-sleep. Her wrists, still raw from the zip ties, throbbed as she sat upright. An officer appeared with a clipboard and a bored expression. "Court," he muttered. "No breakfast, no explanation, just movement, mechanized routine." Marcia sat across the cell, huddled in the corner, blinking slowly as if unsure whether the morning was real or just another cruel dream. When their eyes met, Ariel gave a small nod. The only comfort she could offer Marcia offered a slow thumbs up, but her hand trembled. They were loaded into a transport van with 6 others. No one spoke. The interior reeked of sweat metal and resignation. Through the narrow, mesh-covered windows, the city rolled past, oblivious and indifferent. When they arrived at the courthouse, Ariel stepped out first, shackled at the wrists and ankles. She was marched through a side entrance, down a narrow hallway, and into courtroom 2B. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air was sterile, heavy with paper polish and judgment. Inside, she was met with familiar faces. Judge Susan Whitmore sat on the bench, flipping lazily through her docket. Public defender Michael Hensley leaned against the defense table, coffee in hand, eyes glazed from sleep or disinterest. Officers Foster and Cooper stood in the back, arms crossed, postures relaxed like men watching a rerun of their favorite show. Ariel and Marcia were led to a long wooden bench along the wall. They sat shoulder to shoulder, neither of them speaking. The room was barely half full, but every presence felt sharp like a judgment passed before a single word was spoken. The session began. Case after case moved like fast food orders: trespassing, public nuisance, failure to comply. The defendants, mostly black or brown, were shuffled in, offered no more than a name and a few seconds of half-hearted legal defense before being sentenced to community service fines or time served. Ariel kept her eyes low, but she was recording. The micro camera stitched into the seam of her coat, blinked once, active. Every word, every smirk, every sideways glance. Captured. When her name was called. Warren. Ariel. She stood slowly, the chain between her ankles clinking against the linoleum floor. Hensley didn't bother rising with her. "Same charges, Your Honor," he said without looking up. "She's still not cooperating. Recommend deferred judgment." Whitmore barely glanced at Ariel. So noted. Deferred judgment entered. And just like that, it was done. But not for Ariel. In the back of the courtroom, Brian Cooper lifted his phone. He wasn't even pretending to hide it anymore. The screen was tilted slightly toward Ariel and Marcia. He was filming again. Probably for that same private group chat. Probably to send another mocking caption to his buddies. Brooklyn's finest, or something worse. Ariel caught his eye for a fraction of a second. He grinned. She looked away, but her lens didn't. Suddenly, Marcia swayed beside her. Ariel turned, catching her just before she slipped off the bench. "Marcia," she whispered. "I'm okay," Marcia muttered weakly, her lips dry, her face pale. "Just dizzy. Didn't eat." A bailiff glanced their way but said nothing. No water, no concern. Ariel's arm stayed firm behind Marcia's back, steadying her as the woman tried to sit upright again. Her hands wanted to shake, her chest wanted to rise with anger, but she didn't break character, because in this courtroom, silence was more powerful than a scream. As they were led back toward holding, Cooper passed by them and muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "You two should start a podcast. Trash talk." Ariel didn't blink. She just walked forward, camera still rolling, eyes still down, heart still burning because justice wasn't going to come from yelling. It would come from letting them bury themselves in their own cruelty while she captured every shovel of it. And in that quiet, humiliating parade of power, they still didn't know who she really was. But soon they would. Back in the holding cell, the walls felt smaller than the night before. The air was thicker, staler. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the sour smell of bleach and sweat clung to the walls like residue from every injustice that had passed through Ariel. Sat in the corner, head bowed, arms wrapped around herself, still in character, still invisible. But her ears were sharp, always listening. From the hallway just outside the bars, she heard a familiar voice. "Officer Greg Foster. Doesn't take much to break 'em," he laughed. "You rough up their pride a little, they fold like paper, especially the ones who think they're strong. You can see it in their eyes that moment. They know they ain't special." Another officer chuckled in response, too far to identify. Foster went on as if enjoying the echo of his own voice. "Like the tall one today," he said. "You see the way she kept her head down. She's close. One more push." Ariel's hands tightened around her coat sleeves. Her camera was on, capturing every word. But it wasn't just evidence anymore. It was personal. Across the cell. Marcia Lewis stirred. She'd been quiet since they were brought back. Her breathing was shallow. She kept pressing her arm where deep bruises had darkened since the arrest. "Hey," Ariel said gently, crouching beside her. "How bad is it?" Marcia gave a bitter smile, though her eyes were glassy. "Hurts like hell," she said. "But I've had worse." There was a pause, a heavy one. Then softly Marcia added, "Wasn't my first time dealing with that bastard." Ariel blinked. "Foster." Marcia nodded slowly, a flicker of something old and painful surfacing in her expression. 3 years ago, outside the shelter on Livingston, he slammed me to the ground because I wouldn't clear the curb fast enough. Said I was blocking foot traffic. Broke 2 of my ribs. Ariel's stomach turned. "Did you file a complaint?" Marcia scoffed. "Oh, honey, I did more than that. Had a nurse document, it filled out the forms, even talked to a precinct supervisor. Thought someone would actually care." She looked away. "But by the time I checked in a week later, the complaint was gone, like I'd never filed it. They said maybe I misremembered. Maybe I was high. Maybe it was someone else entirely." Ariel stared at her fury rising beneath her calm. Marcia's voice dropped to a whisper. "They made me feel crazy. And after a while, I stopped fighting." Ariel didn't speak. She just reached into the lining of her coat and tapped twice on the fabric near her collarbone, a silent signal. The camera was still on. The world would hear this story now. And then. Her coat vibrated. A faint pulse from a device stitched into the lining, barely noticeable but unmistakable to her. Victor Monroe, her handler, the only person in the world who knew who she really was and what she was doing here. The vibration pattern was short and coded. ... phase 2. Green lit. Ariel exhaled slowly. Her time as a ghost was nearly up, but before she emerged, she had to finish collecting the one thing that couldn't be faked. The truth buried beneath silence. She turned to Marcia. "That complaint. Do you remember the supervisor's name?" Marcia nodded. Captain Howley, but he's retired now. Ariel filed it away. Every thread mattered, because what they thought was a stray woman forgotten by the system was in fact an agent unraveling it from the inside. And now that Foster had shown his true face again, the story was no longer just about exposure. It was about reckoning, and it was coming fast. The courtroom was running on autopilot again. Judge Susan Whitmore sighed between cases, barely looking up from the docket. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a heartbeat no one paid attention to. Officer Foster leaned casually against the back wall, arms crossed, smirking like usual. Cooper stood beside him, phone in hand, thumbs moving, probably editing another clip to send to his chat group. And there was Ariel Warren, same tattered coat, same matted hair, same expressionless stare as she was led to the front once more, chains softly clinking with each step. But today something had changed. Her shoulders no longer sagged. Her chin was lifted just slightly. Her gaze no longer dropped at the weight of the room. The courtroom clerk called out the name with the same indifference as always. Case 2183B, Warren Ariel. Public defender Michael Hensley barely looked up from his notes. Trespassing, second count. Recommending community service. The judge didn't even glance at her. Noted defendant. Do you understand the charges against Ariel? Interrupted. For the first time, her voice clear, measured, unshaking, Your Honor. I am not the defendant in this courtroom. The room froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Judge Whitmore looked up, eyes narrowing. Excuse me. Ariel lifted her hands, slowly, deliberately. Her fingers moved to the seams of her coat. One by one, she unfastened the hidden closures. As the coat slid off her shoulders, gasps rose from the gallery. Underneath was a pressed black blouse, crisp slacks, and clipped to her belt. A gold badge. She pulled the credentials from her inner pocket and held them up to the court. My name is Special Agent Ariel Warren, FBI. I've been operating undercover for 48 days under Directive 276C, codename Hollow Veil. This courtroom, this department has been under federal surveillance. Cooper dropped his phone. Foster pushed off the wall. You're lying, Foster spat. This is a setup. But before he could take another step, two figures entered the courtroom from the rear double doors. Victor Monroe. Dark suit, stone face. FBI, Carla Benson, sharp-eyed, holding a stack of binders. They walked down the aisle like the gravity in the room had shifted in their favor. Agents of the Department of Justice, Monroe announced. We are here with federal summonses for officers, Gregory Foster and Brian Cooper under the Civil Rights Violations Act and Section 242 of Title 18. We are also entering into evidence 37 audio and video files documenting unlawful arrest procedures, abuse of authority, harassment, and obstruction of justice. A stunned silence gave way to chaos. Foster turned toward Cooper. What did you do? I didn't. You were the one recording. You think that matters now? Order, Judge Whitmore shouted, but her voice cracked. Her hands shook. In the gallery, the stenographer's hands froze over her keyboard. One of the clerks, a middle-aged woman who had watched these proceedings unfold for years without saying a word, began to cry quietly. She wasn't alone. Two junior court officers seated by the gallery rail looked down at their shoes, ashamed. For them, it wasn't just the shock of seeing an FBI badge. It was the weight of their own silence, the realization that they had stood by day after day as Foster mocked, as Cooper filmed, as justice was turned into a performance for the powerful. Marcia, still seated on the bench in the defendant row, whispered, I knew it. I knew she wasn't one of us. But Lord, I never thought she'd be one of them. Ariel turned toward her. Their eyes met, and Ariel gave the smallest nod, not of apology, but of promise. This wasn't over. But the illusion was. And the reckoning had finally begun. The city didn't sleep that night. By the time the court recessed, the footage had already gone viral, not through official press releases, but through a single leaked clip posted anonymously to a public channel titled Justice Doesn't Wear a Uniform. The video was short, just over 3 minutes. It opened with Officer Greg Foster chuckling as he muttered, "You can smell the gutter on them before they even speak," followed by Brian Cooper holding up his phone, zooming in on Ariel during her court appearance, captioning it, Brooklyn's next top convict. No editing, no music, just grainy footage and raw, undeniable truth. Within hours, hashtags flooded social media, hashed Brooklyn Reckoning, Warren Unmasked, #Justice. For the forgotten news anchors stumbled over each other trying to frame the narrative. Some called it the greatest undercover operation in recent memory. Others questioned the ethics of deception. But the public wasn't waiting for consensus. People were angry because they hadn't just seen two officers mock a woman. They had seen themselves, their neighbors, their family, reduced to punchlines in a system that was supposed to protect them. At a hastily organized press conference the next morning, Leonard Briggs, a longtime civil rights activist and community leader from Flatbush, took the podium. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice was low, deliberate, and every syllable carved into the silence around him. "We didn't need an FBI agent to tell us this was happening," he said. "We knew. We lived it. But now the whole world has seen it, and they can't look away anymore." He paused, lifting his eyes to the cameras. "This isn't about two officers. This is about a culture that raised them to believe people without power don't matter, that pain is funny and silence is survival. That stops now." Cheers erupted from the crowd. Dozens of journalists jostled to get quotes. Briggs didn't stay long. He said what needed to be said and left the rest to burn. Meanwhile, inside the system, things were complicated. Ariel returned to FBI headquarters under full protection but not full support. Her badge had never felt heavier. Some agents welcomed her back like a hero. Others avoided her entirely. In closed-door meetings, terms like liability optics and chain of command kept surfacing. Her operation had succeeded undeniably, but in doing so, she had also exposed how complacent institutions had become, including her own. Behind the glass walls of federal offices, she could feel a slow, tightening resistance. They weren't questioning her results. They were questioning her audacity. Victor Monroe stood beside her through it all, calm, loyal. But even he couldn't shield her from whispers rising through the ranks. "You made some enemies," he told her quietly. "And not all of them wear uniforms." Ariel didn't flinch. She hadn't done this for applause. She had done it for truth. And truth always came with a price. As she sat in her temporary office that night going over transcripts for the next wave of federal charges, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No name. Just a sentence. "You've done enough. Step back or we'll push you." Ariel stared at the screen. Not surprised, not afraid, but absolutely sure of one thing. She wasn't stepping back because the collapse had already started. And this time she was making sure it didn't stop halfway. The hallway outside Ariel's office at FBI headquarters had never felt so quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet, the watching kind, the waiting kind. Ariel had walked this corridor for 6 years long before she ever wore a wire, long before she made headlines. Now every step echoed like a challenge. Inside the building, fractures had begun to show. Some agents especially, the younger ones, nodded at her in solidarity. A few left notes on her desk, words like respect or simply thank you. But others, they weren't so subtle. One senior agent passed her in the break room and muttered, "We do investigations, not stunts." Another left a file on her desk with a post-it attached. "This isn't how change happens." The worst part. It wasn't just resentment, it was fear. Her success had thrown a spotlight on what others had learned to ignore, and now they had to choose. Stand with her, or protect the system they'd built careers inside. Even Victor Monroe, her handler and closest ally, looked exhausted. His tone stayed professional, but there was a new tension in his voice, like he was walking a line he couldn't fully admit. "Ariel," he said one morning, closing the door behind him. "You've kicked a hornet's nest, and some of those hornets wear suits. They're not just questioning your tactics, they're questioning whether you can still be trusted with discretion." She blinked. Discretion. "They think you've gone rogue, like your loyalty shifted from the agency to the street." Ariel didn't answer right away, because in a way they weren't wrong. Later that evening, back in her apartment, the threats started. Handwritten letters slipped under her door, notes taped to her mailbox. One read simply, "Keep talking, and we'll find out what justice looks like without a badge." She changed her locks, rerouted her calls, avoided her favorite coffee shop. But the damage wasn't fear, it was isolation, until Tasha Green found her. Tasha was fire in human form, a 25-year-old activist from East Flatbush with a shaved head, gold hoops, and a voice that could shake City Hall. They met at a community roundtable. Ariel had been reluctantly asked to attend. The room was full of city leaders, lawyers, activists, and tension so thick it made the air hard to breathe. Tasha stood up mid-meeting and called it out. "Y'all act like change is a policy paper," she said, "but we watched a black woman crawl through hell just to make you look." And now that she's bleeding, nobody wants to hand her a damn towel. Everyone turned toward Ariel, but she didn't flinch. Afterward, Tasha found her outside, leaned on the concrete steps and lit a cigarette. "You look like you're carrying the whole city on your back," she said. Ariel managed a small smile. "Feels like it." Tasha flicked ash off her sleeve. "Then maybe it's time someone helped carry it." They began meeting quietly. Tasha brought her into rooms Ariel had never stepped into. Barbershops, church basements, block association meetings, no press, no protection. Just people. And slowly, Ariel began to feel it again. The reason she had gone undercover in the first place. Not for headlines, not for policy, but for people. Change. Tasha told her one night, doesn't start at the top. It starts wherever someone stops being afraid. Ariel nodded, because the fear hadn't left her. But it wasn't in control anymore. It was now something else, something sharper, more focused, conviction. And if the institutions she once trusted were cracking, then maybe it was time to build something new. The courthouse that had once been a stage for humiliation now became the venue for reckoning. Greg Foster and Brian Cooper sat at the defendant's table dressed not in uniform but in dull, off-the-rack suits. Their badges were gone, so were the smug grins. This time the judge did look up. "This court finds sufficient grounds," she announced, to proceed with full criminal trial under charges of civil rights violations, assault, falsification of reports, and abuse of power. Gasps filled the gallery. Foster clenched his jaw. Cooper slumped in his seat, sweat blooming under his collar. It was only the beginning. The courtroom was filled not with supporters, but with eyes watching, recording, remembering. Ariel sat silently near the back. No disguise, no wire, just her and her truth. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Marcia Lewis stood on the steps of a community center, this time not in rags, but in a clean gray cardigan, with her hair neatly wrapped and her back straight. She had been through rehab twice. The first time had failed, but this time something had shifted, because this time someone had seen her. Ariel had made sure of that. Marcia now worked part-time at HopeLink, a grassroots housing support program that helped formerly homeless women navigate the bureaucracy of shelter systems, housing applications, and trauma recovery. On her desk sat a small framed printout of a quote she'd handwritten. "I'm not the woman they laughed at. I'm the woman who stood back up." Clients didn't know her full story. Most just called her Miss Marcia and trusted her because of the way she listened. She didn't talk much about the courtroom anymore, but every time someone handed her a folded eviction notice or asked how to apply for emergency shelter, she remembered the way those cold court benches felt, and it made her fight harder. Back in the city's law enforcement structure, a quiet storm had been building. Young officers had begun whispering to each other in locker rooms and hallway corners and over burner phones. They talked about what they'd seen, what they'd ignored, what they were afraid to say. But one voice finally broke through the silence. Officer Kevin Drake, 28 years old, with only 2 years on the force, stood before the Internal Affairs Review Board and then before cameras. "My name is Kevin Drake," he said, "and I've seen what happens behind those precinct walls. I've seen officers threaten people for talking back. I've heard racial slurs used in squad cars like it's part of the radio chatter. And I've been afraid every day of losing my badge if I ever spoke up." He paused, looked into the lens. "I'm not afraid anymore." That night the city trembled again. Ariel watched the broadcast from her apartment, her arms crossed as Kevin's voice cracked near the end of his statement. Tasha, seated beside her on the couch, whispered, "You started this." "No," Ariel replied quietly. "He did. I just gave him the room." Within 24 hours, Kevin's video had 2 million views. Anonymous tips began flooding the department's civilian complaint system. Names, dates, details. The silence was unraveling, and in its place, something new was starting to form. Not hope, not yet, but accountability. And that was enough, for now. Ariel sat alone in a quiet corner of the FBI's New York field office, a formal letter on the desk in front of her. The offer was generous. Assistant Director of Internal Oversight, a newly formed role shaped directly from the fallout of her operation. Better pay, a larger team. National influence. She had earned it, deserved it, but she wasn't going to take it, because Ariel Warren didn't go undercover just to rise in rank. She did it so that no one else would have to disappear to be heard. She picked up a pen, signed the decline letter, and quietly slid it back into the envelope. Weeks later, in a sun-filled lot off Parkside Avenue, construction crews cleared the final scaffolding from the entrance to a bold new space, the Civilian Justice Initiative. Its mission was simple: independent, community-driven investigations into misconduct and abuse, run by lawyers, advocates, former public defenders, trauma counselors, and survivors. Ariel founded it not to replace law enforcement, but to hold it to its promises. No sirens, no uniforms, just transparency, truth, and accountability. She took no title, no corner office, just a desk among the others beside a bulletin board covered in handwritten messages from people across the city. Thank you for not looking away. You made me believe again. I finally filed my complaint today. I wasn't scared anymore. Outside, a mural stretched across the brick wall beside the building, 40 feet wide, painted in sweeping hues of dusk and dawn. It showed faceless silhouettes rising together, hands lifted not in protest but in affirmation, and above them 5 bold words in deep indigo. We were never invisible. It stopped pedestrians mid-step. It drew school field trips and phone cameras. Some wept when they saw it. Others simply stood in silence. In a city where silence had once been a death sentence, this was now a declaration. What no one expected was how far her story would ripple. First it was Newark, then Oakland, then St. Louis cities, with their own ghosts, their own broken precincts and bruised histories. Local organizers, empowered by Ariel's courage, launched civilian-led review boards, task forces, art campaigns. One nonprofit in Detroit named its entire outreach wing after her. In Atlanta, a group of young black law students began a project documenting misconduct case by case, inspired by her hidden camera work. And in Chicago, a teenage girl wrote in her essay for college admissions, "If Ariel Warren could risk everything to be heard, maybe I can speak up in my school too." Ariel rarely granted interviews. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She'd had enough of spotlights when they were forced upon her. But one day she agreed to sit with a classroom of 8th graders in Brooklyn Heights. Just an open conversation. A girl raised her hand and asked, "Were you scared?" Ariel smiled gently. "Yes," she said. "Every single day." "Then why did you keep going?" Ariel paused, looked around at their young, open faces. "Because fear doesn't disappear when you hide. It disappears when you walk straight through it and keep walking." That night, back at her apartment, Ariel stood by the window watching the city exhale under the orange glow of streetlights. There was still injustice, still darkness, still struggle. But she also saw movement now. Conversations, murals, marches. And for the first time in years, she felt something powerful stir in her chest. Not vengeance, not victory, visibility. She whispered to herself, and maybe to the world, "You can't unsee us now." And in the quiet that followed, it wasn't the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of something new. Something rising. Ariel Warren didn't wear a cape. She wore dirt, silence and patience until the world had no choice but to listen. She gave up her comfort so others could reclaim their dignity, and in doing so, she reminded us that justice doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it whispers beneath the weight of invisibility, waiting for someone brave enough to speak. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel seen, don't just scroll away. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that challenge power and lift voices often left unheard, because the next reckoning might begin with silence too.